Hello, welcome to our lecture today on world religions and religious studies. I've marched you through this distinction between religion and religion departments, which study and teach theology or give instruction in how to be religious, as opposed to religious studies, which is a department that studies religion, the academic study of religion. So this will be our last sort of state of the field type of lectures, and we're going to move on to doing more active comparisons of religious content in the coming weeks, especially coming up fast is our Magic Day next week. All right, so first off, I want to look at the article by Sam Gill that was called The Academic Study of Religion. Sam Gill is an emeritus professor at CU Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder. He's a scholar of not only Native American traditions or First Nations religions, but he has become a very prominent scholar of dance. He teaches dance practice all over the country, but especially here in Denver. He actually teaches all over in a bunch of high schools, teaching up to 30 different styles of salsa dance. He's traveled all over the world to study dance in his later career. He's also a lovely gentleman. When I saw him recently give a lecture, he actually had a friend of mine dance with him for a long time, and as he danced with her, he would explain sort of the meanings of the dance and specifically in Central American cultures. On the other hand, he has also been known, I have another colleague who's a professional hip hop dancer in addition to being a Buddhologist, and he's been known to tango, literally tango, with Sam Gill and Sam Gill students. Anyway, so actually, Sam Gill had an original idea that was very exciting in the 1970s. He'd been studying Navajo and Hopi traditions, and he turned to a number of colleagues and said, you know what, I don't think there's a Mother Earth in Native American religions. And everyone said, there has to be a Mother Earth. Native Americans are always, when we talk to them, we're always talking about Mother Earth. And he said, I don't think it's originally there. So he went back and found that the original usage of the term Mother Earth or Earth as a mother were stated by Westerners studying Native American traditions. The Native Americans then took that idea from the Westerners and used it to interpret their own religions when explaining them to Westerners some more, sort of pizza effect. Sam Gill posits a technique called story tracking. And this came out of his own experience, where he was studying Aboriginal Australian religions and the idea of the axis mundi. An early scholar had said that when these Aboriginal Australians dance around a pole, they're dancing around this pole that is the fulcrum or is the center, the axis of the earth. So Gill goes back and tries to find the earliest descriptions of the Aboriginal people describing this. These were cited by the scholar Mircea Eliade, and finds, in fact, that the earliest documents don't have any of this imagery about the axis mundi. So from there, he starts just tracking out different stories about poles, different stories about dances, and shows how Westerners, when they interpret religious data, bring their own interpretations on, so much so sometimes that the culture that they are studying representing does not even seem honestly represented. So what is the state of religions in 1994? Gill wrote this article in the Journal of the American Academy of Religions. And sorry. So what he's arguing is that religion and religious studies departments need to be different from seminaries. Seminaries are where people learn to practice religion and gain theological instruction in order to be ministers or clerics. He argues, in fact, that we need to have the academic study of religion, which is not doing theology, which does not explore normative religion and is not in service of religious practitioners, whereas the majority of religion and religious studies departments and the majority of meetings at our large annual gathering, the American Academy of Religions, are based on Christian traditions. And even if you look through the catalog of the American Academy of Religions, about half of them, about half of the entries of the talks and the conference sessions are very much for practitioners of Christian religion. So what we need to do is we need to study religion, not work to propagate religion. So he lays out a number of ideas for how we should study religions in religious studies, and he stresses this is the academic study of religion, so it is not the put in practice study of religion. So he argues that there should be no affiliation of a scholar with a religious group. So someone might be a Buddhist or might be a Christian or whatnot, but as you're working as a professor and as you're professing, you should not be representing the tradition. You are not there to prove that your version of Hinduism is best, or that the Shi'i or the Shiite school of Islam is that you happen to be a member of is better than, say, the Sunni school. It should be having sensitivity to multiculturalism. So we are always studying varied and various other cultures and being sensitive to how those cultures depict themselves, and to not normalizing any one culture over the other. It is being various and varied in studying multiple religions at all time. Religions and the academic study of religions refers to all religions, not just Christianity. When we just say religion in general, we are generally saying something that's synonymous with Christianity. The academic study of religion is not religious, but it is the study of religion. When we do religious studies, we are studying religion. We are not propounding religion itself or doing religion itself. Our methods are comparative, so that's within traditions and among traditions. The very text, the very source, the very data we study just begs for comparison, whether it's comparing between two schools within a tradition, or that is, studying different deities within a tradition and a polytheistic system, or the constant comparison that we do between comparing data that we discover about religion and our own religious lives. So religion is a part, if not the totality, I would argue, of human culture. So as a human endeavor, our goals in the studying of religion is to understand multiple religions, i.e. having religious literacy, and to learn about ourselves as human beings, which is the product of the humanities, of all humanities scholarship, whether that be literature or religious studies. We are always trying to understand more about the nature of humanity, and to some degree the nature of ourselves responding to humanity. So the proper academic study of religion. Now, Sam Gill definitely gets on his horse about this, and he says that it needs to be academic. And we need to have, in religious studies, our own disciplinary language, when in fact the majority of religious studies usually just borrows from anthropology, sociology, history, and literature. I would argue that over the years, through scholars like Jeffrey Kripal, we have developed our own understanding of religion, which doesn't just parrot sociology in many ways. So the field is academic, it is Western, and it is intellectual, but we never frame it as such. Most scholars, in fact, act as if the only key to our work and the only sort of value we have as professors and experts of these religions is that we are very sensitive to the religions. Not that we have a rigorous methodology, but that we can be open almost to not having a methodology, that we can sort of study anything without reducing it and without explaining away religion. Many people would say religious studies is the field that takes religion seriously, whereas all the other fields do not take religion seriously, which I don't buy at all. There's definitely some reductionism in non-religious studies of religion, such as anthropology. What do I mean by reductionism? Reductionism is to explain away, usually by a materialist reading of religion. So Marx would argue that religion is the opiate of the people. Religion works to get people thinking about gods so they don't notice that they're noticing so that they don't notice their inequality in the world or their poverty. So we are perceived as having this greater sensitivity and to not reduce. But in fact, anytime you study anything, you're doing some sense of reduction. So, I mean, if I'm studying bhakti, which that is the religion of love between man and God in Hinduism, and having a devout emotional relationship, I mean, I'm going to make arguments that are psychological, these are about psychological processes and wanting to return to the love of a mother or the love of childhood, or this is acting out, psychic needs that is like someone feels empty on the inside in their daily life, maybe in their romantic life, so they have a romantic, emotional relationship with God. We're always making some sense of reductions. So arguing that religious studies is completely anti-reductive doesn't quite work. So what is So what is religion here that we're really getting at is like I said, it's an academic field. It's a place, however, for most scholars, religion and religious studies is a place where they can study their specialty. So definitely the way that I was taught religious studies when I first approached it as an undergraduate was not to look at overall themes of religion or religious discourse around the world, but it was religious studies as a place to grow in my understanding of Hinduism, because my professor was a Hindu, and he definitely saw his goal in teaching religious studies was to glorify Hinduism and the Hindu people. So it's an academic field, as I'd said. And while many professors think that it is just a place to do their specialization, there are bigger questions. We need to talk about religion generally. While we may do something like produce elegant monographs on our specializations, such as my work on magic, I need to be able to speak about religion more generally. Again, to critique my original teacher, John Grimes, he always used to say, within religiondom, all are safe and confined meaning. So for him, religion was this force of good in the world that essentially everyone would come to the same conclusions if they studied religion enough, and those conclusions would be the same as Advaita Vedanta. So he had this idea like all religions are good, but we'll all come to the same conclusion, which is this style of Hinduism. Not unlike for so long the study of religious studies is all religion is good, and sooner or later we'll all understand the ultimate truth of Christianity. The reality is that religion is socially constructed. It's not a thing that actually really exists out there. There is no religious capacity in people. There is only the play of culture. Furthermore, if we argue that there is this thing called religion that animates all religions, people generally argue that that's good. Well, religion can be bad for you. Look at religious terrorism. Look at all of the atrocious and appalling things that religious authorities do to non-religious people. Look at the hateful ideologies of hells and heavens that come out. Religion might just be bad for you, and I would recommend you be very suspicious of anyone who consistently argues that religion is essentially good. So what about Native American religions? And Sam Gill has a very specific argument here about his own field. He argues that Native American studies has been sort of ignored by religious studies in general because it doesn't have scripture, it's orally transmitted, it's based on performance. These are things that religious studies has traditionally not been good at studying. What we have been good at studying is locating scriptures, translating them, explaining what they mean. But what do you do if you have a religious tradition that doesn't have scripture, or that their actions are about enacting stories, not about telling stories? They're performative. So within his field even further, there's the question of, and this was a hot issue in the 90s and the 80s, is can a non-native person do religious studies of Native Americans? Sam Gill is obviously not native himself. I feel that bears stating. So there's a couple of interesting arguments in here. One would be that native folk came to religious studies, were able to study legitimately their own culture and perceive their own culture and do ethnographies of their own culture, of which they already knew their languages. Fine. But that's not going beyond and talking about religion in general, or even talking about Native American religions more widely. Now, a non-native might need to learn the languages and do the field work. They don't automatically have, well, they haven't learned the languages and they don't have the background studying these rituals. And Sam Gill says, if people are going to argue that it's even possible for a person like that to study, then they're messed up. That's not academic. So he says, because there's this critique that says that non-native people haven't done the field work and haven't learned the languages. Well, if they learn the languages and they hang out, then they're perfectly capable of engaging in religious studies. This ended up being a hot political argument, but the thing that Sam Gill is missing, and time has changed, is that when we do Native American studies, we need to critique sort of the Western perspective. So a non-native can do Native American studies, but they cannot reproduce the dominant, reductive, dismissive, and appropriative understandings of religions and Native American religions that have been propounded by Westerners, or by non-natives studying native religions. He argues more and more that Native American scholars need to move outside of just talking to one another or just looking at their own basic specialty to engage in wider religious questions, such as questions about ritual and cosmogony, so how the world was made, and performance. These days, Gill is studying dance, and he is able to get a lot out of studying dance and performances. So what's the implications of all of this? And I realize I forgot to make a slide for it. First off, religious studies needs to develop its own categories and methodologies. Second, religious studies scholars must be fluent in languages and do field work and know content. So you can't just go talking about Hinduism unless you learn Hindi and you go and hang out in India or Tamil or Bengali or whatever. You have to go and do the field work, and you have to learn the languages. If you haven't done the field work and you haven't done the languages, you don't have a place at the table in any way. And even to acknowledge that someone might have a place at the table if they have that is to say that the field of religious studies might be inherently flawed. Contents of study need to extend beyond textual and philosophical. We need to open up our fields of research to performance, to architecture, we need to study texts, but we need to go beyond texts. Religious studies scholars must compare and move across traditions to have a wider conversation about the nature of religions and religions. So we do comparison in order to get a sense of this human cultural endeavor that we think of as religion that is not inherently existing on its own, but is always mediated by culture. And finally, religious studies must move away from training people to be more religious or to be religious and move further toward religious literacy and having people be able to use our methodology to make sense of the world. Okay, so here's the breakdown. We're going to read this introduction of Tomoko Masuzawa's The Invention of World Religion. So I wanted to talk to you about how to use this text. Well, sometimes you don't have time to read a whole book. So what do? I recommend you read the intro, you read the conclusion, and you read the bibliography. That's how I read a book. Now, you're probably not going to read the bibliography, but if you got a book and you need to figure it out quick, you can just read the introduction. Now, if you note in the introduction by Masuzawa, but you should also read the conclusion, she has this like 4-page chunk that just explains what she does in each chapter. This is found in most academic books. So when you read the introduction to the book, when they say, in chapter 1, I'm going to do this, in chapter 2, I'm going to do this, in chapter 2, I'm going to do 3, don't span through that real quick. Read that carefully so you know where the book is going. And if you don't have time to read it, that might be enough for you to just be able to have something to say about it in class or to write about it in a paper. Another great strategy to do when you don't have time to read a bunch of books is go and look for a book review. What's a book review? Academics are able to contact publishers and they are given free books, considering they will write a book review. A book review is usually about 1,000 words, and it summarizes a book, explains its place in the academic field of its subfield, and then gives some judgments on that book. So if you read a couple of book reviews, you're going to get good summaries, and you're going to get some good arguments about those books. If you still have a little bit more time and you've read the intro and the conclusion and read some book reviews, another strategy I recommend is you go through the whole book and just read the topic sentences. What is a topic sentence? In every paragraph, the first sentence in all academic formal writing should be the overall argument of the paragraph. So you write the overall argument of the paragraph, and then you give your information, and then you have a concluding sentence that will transition into the next paragraph. One of the ways to get through a book very quick is to skip the data and just read those arguments that are the topic sentences. Moral of the story also, when you're writing, always have topic sentences in every paragraph. Okay, the second part of our lecture for today is about Tomoko Masuzawa and this notion of world religion and where does world religion come from. Tomoko Masuzawa is an intellectual historian. She studies the 19th century. In particular, she studies the way people conceived of religion and how that contributed to how we think of religion in the 20th and the 21st century. She's written on the intellectual history of psychoanalysis and anthropology. Not unlike Gill's story tracking, she first studied the intersection of anthropology and psychology in Aboriginal Australian religions, and had her own critique of Mircea Eliade, the guy that talked about the world axis, the axis mundi, that Gill ended up critiquing as well. She's a professor at University of Michigan, and she received her PhD from University of Santa Barbara. Go Gauchos, where I did my PhD. This book, The Invention of World Religions, was a bombshell. It just, boom, it just exploded. I remember reading it before a lot of my pals, and I remember sitting in a little restaurant in Nashville reading it and going, wow, really, all that's implicated in when I posit a world religions class? Man, that does make a lot of sense. It's a heck of a book. She writes in a somewhat dense but remarkably clear style. And I've noticed that this book is taught in almost all graduate schools today amongst religious studies graduate students. Okay, so what's the field? Hold on a second here. Okay. Usually the term world religions attempts to survey, or a class in world religions tries to do all the non-Western religions with very little overarching theme other than that all religions have something, or all cultures have something called religion. World religion suggests that there are religions of the greater world than Christianity or Judaism. So generally when people say world religions, they mean we're not just going to do Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The instructors for these, not unlike me, are generally Westerners that are experts in non-Western traditions. Why is this? It's thought that somebody that does Christianity or Judaism just doesn't have enough exposure to teach a world religions course. So our world religions professors generally are experts in non-Western religions, or maybe even Islam. The idea here is that we just assume that most of these scholars are white Western Christians or Jews, and would argue that via studying another non-Western tradition, they know at least two traditions well. So I would know Hinduism very well, and I would know Christianity very well by growing up a Hindu. Or by growing up a Christian. That's a lot of implications, and obviously doesn't really work out in the long run. Because there are plenty of brown folk and Indians who grew up in India that study religion now. So just this underlying implication that most professors are Westerns with Christian orientation is a little ridiculous. These are high enrollment courses. These are introductory courses. As such, they make quite a bit of money for religious studies departments. So Masuzawa makes this point. She says, just because it's economically effective doesn't mean it's a good style of thinking or it's the right style of thinking about anything. And that's worth all of us holding on to. All right, so religions are usually demarcated in like a world religions textbook in a very specific way. They'll say world religion, they'll put up a map, and on that map, you'll see all these different religions that are in different places. Well, this is problematic. I mean, look at this map here. It has the countries lined up, and it has this, there's problems with this in several ways. There's an implicit argument that religions sort of operate in a specific place. There's an implicit argument that they don't overlap. There's an implicit argument that they usually line up according to our contemporary country or nation sort of boundaries. So when you really look at religion on the ground, it never looks so neat as this. And then there's also the question of how can any specific religion be able to claim a place in this way? How does that operate? All right, so religious studies as a phrase, not religious studies, but world religions as a phrase sort of emerges in the 1920s, but it pulls from 19th century thought. Masuzawa has this great argument. She says it's rhizomatic. So that's as in, a plant comes up, like a mushroom comes up or whatnot, and then below the surface are all these spreading out diffused rhizomes. She argues, or little plant parts. She argues that in 1920, world religions come up, but it's operating based on all these ideas from the 19th century. And then really buried under this word world religion is a valuation that something like Christianity is the highest stage of religious evolution, and that all religions will evolve in some way to look like Christianity. So here we could argue that the earliest forms of Hinduism are correlated with scriptural revelation, and the ending evolution of Hinduism would be something like what I talked about before, which is bhakti, in which one has a near monotheistic relationship with a personal deity. I remember sitting at a cocktail party one time with my family members, and I heard one very Christian man from my church growing up say, well, you know, when you really talk about Hinduism and Christianity, it's all really the same. It's about loving God. And I'm like, you know, that sat funny in my craw when I was younger. I've thought about it often. And there is a sense that religion is at its very core of man and God and what it means to have salvation, what it means to have a soul. But those don't line up in these other religions when we really start looking at them. So religion is thought to be that which civilizes. Religion is thought to civilize folks, and anything that's not civilized, that doesn't line up with sort of Western ideals of the individual and the soul and God, should be considered pre-modern. And remember, when we're talking about religions, they really are talking about religions in the modern world, and the modern world is like this modern turn toward science, toward progressiveness, towards rationality. So when we say that something is pre-modern, we're saying that it is effectively not valuable. Yes. Okay. So when we're talking about world religions, there is an idea of historical religion. What is a historical religion? Well, a historical religion is a religion that has an army. It's a religion that enters into history, that influences history. So the little traditions or animistic traditions would be considered pre-modern and not historical religions. So Christ enters the world, creates Christianity, that leads to the Roman Empire, then it continues into the West. Judaism is a historical religion because you can place it in history when you can look at specific events. Hinduism traditionally was not considered a world religion because it didn't have influence on the world stage, as Europeans said. But once people really studied it, they saw there were Hindu dynasties that did have large changes and did cause large changes in the world and in world history. There's also a notion of national religions. That is the notion that, and the most national religions would obviously be Judaism. But there is an idea that religions are associated with a nation. You hear the idea of the United States as a Christian nation. So there you have an idea of a national religion. This does somewhat map onto linguistics. So at a certain point, linguists argued that there are three groups of language. You have Semitic, which is Hebrew and Arabic. You have the Aryan or Indo-European, which would include English, German, Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Hindi, Indo-European or Aryan. And the Turanian, that would be Chinese, Japanese, Tibetan, all of those. And they said that those are the three main language families. Well, what does that leave out? All the Native American religions, all the African religions. So right there, if you're arguing that, that these are the three main linguistic branches, you're leaving out an awful lot of religions and an awful lot of people. So, and I also like to think that what is a historical religion? What is a national religion? It's a religion with an army. So Masuzawa argues that world religions is in fact an exercise in identifying and categorizing the other, an act of othering. So in the 19th century, Western Europeans sort of divided the idea of social sciences into political science, economics, and sociology. And they're like, using that, we can figure out everything. To which then they said, well, what about not Europe? I'm like, ooh, we need these two other disciplines. So they posited anthropology to study pre-modern and non-literate cultures. So you need anthropology to go and study the nature of man who is pre-modern. And that's why anthropology before, the late part of the 20th century was always folks going to find a tribe somewhere and hanging out there for a year and coming back and to tell us about that tribe and what that tribe teaches us about humanity. You couldn't find this in sociology, economics, and political science. There's also the field of Orientalism, and we're going to kind of close down with a discussion of Orientalism. Orientalism focuses on the texts of powerful cultures, specifically the texts of the Arabic world, the texts of China and East Asia, and the texts of South Asia. Now, these cultures, the Chinese culture, the Arabic cultures, Indic cultures, were huge. I mean, very powerful, control large swaths of the globe. But by the time these folks start really studying them, The Europeans had power. They'd colonized these places and established European rule in almost all of them, not as much China. So they needed an apparatus to understand these cultures, and they were literate. They were not pre-literate or pre-modern. They were modern in their own way. So they posited this field called Orientalism. Now, Orientalism, as I said, they have these sort of literary and cultural treasures. So Westerners learned these languages and deeply studied the literature of Asia and the Middle East. Both were considered the Orient, toward the East, where the sun rises. Those cultures who have a continued living practice become also world religions. So Hinduism practiced widely, so that's a world religion, but the practice of a very small deity that is worshipped with offerings of very specific items that is not pan-Indic, that would not be a world religion. It would actually just be called a tribal religion. These days, non-Hindu, non-Muslim folk in India are just called tribals, and they're pretty much ignored. Now they have all sorts of different religions, the tribal religions, but they're not considered world religions. They're not even considered Indian religions. They're considered, well, they would be considered Indian, but they would be considered just sort of pre-modern and sort of existing outside the fold of contemporary translocal religions. So what is Orientalism? To say a little bit more, there's a guy named Edward Said, and he wrote a book called Orientalism in the late 70s, and it went forth to just another bombshell that just changed the field in a lot of ways. Said argues that Said in fact argues that Orientals or Orient people, and when he's talking about the Orient, he's really talking about the Middle East, that the Orient sort of exists for the West in order to be exploited. And when Westerners describe Oriental cultures and what he calls Orientalism, the Oriental people, that sounds so weird to say, or the Orient is considered non-rational, feminine, artistic, and passive. But the West, the Western world, is considered modern, scientific, masculine, rational, and active. So you can clearly see that the one has adjectives that dominate the others. Now, Said has been misread. He wants people to dismantle these unfair characterizations of Oriental, Asian people, and Arab people, and to really kind of open up and show the sophistication of their cultures as being equal in sophistication to Western cultures. He is not saying that Westerners shouldn't study Asia or the Middle East. He's saying that we should study, but be careful to not reproduce the painful and hurtful ideologies of the West that, after all, conquered the East until 1947, after World War II, and you really see the breakup of these colonial authorities, and all of the places that were under the rule of these Western powers became independent. So now I've got a big long quote by a guy named Nicholas Dirks, who is a post-colonialist. So post-colonialism is the studying of what the world looks like after the colonies were dissolved and how colonial thinking still shapes our current way of understanding the world. Nicholas Dirks has studied India in particular very clearly. So when Said, the guy who wrote Orientalism, used the term Orientalism, he meant it in a number of interdependent senses. Okay, what did he mean it by? These senses included the general tendency of thought found throughout colonial establishments in which the Orient was made to be Europe's land, a land of exotic beings and exploitable riches that could service the economy and the imagination of the West. Boom. So that's his one kind of key revolutionary political intervention that Said is saying, is that y'all have looked at the East as an amazing place for you to take and manipulate and plunder. All right. So Orientalism also refers to a much more sophisticated body of scholarship embodied in such practices as philology, remember that's the study of text and language and how they change, archaeology, the study of ruins, the study of buildings and the study of building structures, history and anthropology, all glorifying the classical civilizations of the East. At the same time, this glorifies even more the scholarly endeavors of the West that made possible their recuperation, but suggesting that all history since the classical age was characterized by decline, degeneration, and decadence. So here, you've got all of these academic fields, such as philology, archaeology, history, and anthropology. So those are applied to Asian cultures. We'll just stick with Asian for now. This does a couple of things. One, it says, hey, look at how good our methods are. We can finally understand your culture better than you can. Two, when it really looks, and I'm going to use the example of India here, when it really looks, it posits that there was this glorious period. Usually they talk about the golden age in India, which was a period of about 800 years. And the idea is that at that time, Hindu culture and Sanskrit literature was the best it will ever be, and everything that comes later isn't worth studying and is just degenerated. So in the study of India, most people focused up until the last like 30 years would only focus on that 800-year window. Nowadays, we've discovered that there's far more Sanskrit written after that classical period than one would imagine. But there is a dominant narrative in the study of India that once India and Hinduism were great, then the Muslims conquered and everything started going to hell. Then the British came and everything went even worse. Now you just have the degenerate world of India today that isn't even worthy of study. I would argue it's much more interesting. So Orientalism, as I'm reading again, whether in the guise of colonial cultures of belief or of more specialized subcultures of scholarship, shared fundamental premises about the East, serving to denigrate the present, deny history, and repress any sensitivity regarding contemporary political, social, or cultural autonomy and potential in the colonized world. Orientalism is faded. I mean, we still study these texts, but we see Indians, for instance, as being, you know, human. Human and engaged in history and available to have cultural autonomy, whereas prior colonial thinking about, say, India said that, you know, Indians were like children, that the British were there to colonize, that were there to civilize. We no longer think of religious studies or of religion as civilizing people. So it's much more interesting these days to look at active agency in the post-colonial world, the world that is no longer colonized by the West. And we do not see these religions and cultures as being inherently just open for our own interpretation, for our own, I don't know, pleasure. We look at the conversation between the people we study and ourselves. So what are the implications of this? Well, the implications of Orientalism was that the Orient was the obvious other that is there to be exploited. We can't exploit and colonize people that we think of as ourselves. So it was important to establish Hinduism and Islam and Arabic people and Indian people as being lesser than the Westerners. So we could take their stuff and we could go and say, now be like us, and then you'll be good, because being us is good and being you is bad. The study glorifies Western scholarship. As I said, there is a certain thing where Indian scholars are only now starting to get the recognition that Western scholars studying India are getting, and it's about darn time. There is this notion of classical civilization, which never actually existed, but if you look at most of the study of Asian religions before the 20th century and into the 20th century, you'll see that they were always looking for a glorious, perfect pastime of religion that, in a way, scholars were always sort of wishing they could get back to, but forlorning that, you know, this world exists as it does now and it's nowhere great as in the past. That's this notion of a decline from the golden ages. And it also denigrates the past. It just says, or it denigrates the present. It just says that everything has fallen. I mean, the West is getting better, but everywhere else is going from better to worse. We're going from worse to better. They're going from better to worse. All right, so onward. Like I said, this is the last sort of big picture day. We're going to have a little bit more theory next week, and then we're going to move in and we're just going to start comparing. We're going to start comparing religions. So we're going to return to some of these questions about what is religion, what is religious studies, what is Orientalism, that when we get to the end of the class. And I wanted to make one point in closing. Why do I keep asking, you know, like, what do you think about, what do professors say and whatnot? Well, you're on the team. You're in a religious studies course. That means you are a scholar of religion. Your interpretations are similar to what professors do. I mean, what I do as a professor, I want to give you the tools to be able to do as students to make that process. I mean, sure, I'm not going to teach you Sanskrit, but I can teach you how to interpret a text. The reason why I bring up all of these, what is the field, what do professors do, is because you're basically professors right now. We are in an academic conversation, and every time we think in this academic conversation, we're actually constituting the field. We're making up what is happening in the field right now. So, have a good one.